The Bermuda Triangle is a region in the Atlantic Ocean just off the coast of Florida, where we're told that a large number of airplanes and boats have mysteriously disappeared over the years. Proposed explanations for why planes and ships go missing here include UFOs, wormholes, and even the lost city of Atlantis. There's no need to invoke such paranormal explanations, however, because a variety of prosaic, naturalistic events can account for the Bermuda Triangle disappearances. Not only that, but there's nothing statistically anomalous about the boat or plane losses in this particular region, and even the most extraordinary stories pointed to as proof of the triangle mystery don't actually stand up to scrutiny. Simply put, there's no good reason to believe that anything unique, mysterious, or paranormal is taking place, or has taken place, within the Bermuda Triangle. Hop online to do some reading, and you will find a seemingly endless supply of absurd speculation about the Bermuda Triangle. Is the Bermuda Triangle an interdimensional travel gate? Asks above top secret user Blobby. And that's the big question, isn't it? Fellow user Unholy Enterprise soberly states that, quote, I personally believe the Bermuda Triangle is a gateway to back in time, or so-called back to the past, end quote. Maybe this guy could actually use the Bermuda Triangle to go back in time to elementary school where he can learn how to spell. Muddy Fox adds his 2 cents into this power brainstorming session when he writes that, quote, I believe that the triangle is just water above a alien base, because of all the spacecraft seen going into the water around there. Also, it is well known that the aliens live in the water on this planet, end quote. Ah, yes, it's well known apparently. Exercise is good for you, smoking is bad for you, aliens live underwater. These are well-known facts about the world that we live in. My personal favorite explanation manages to combine 5 or 6 paranormal ideas into a single sentence. As user Blobby2 puts it, quote, is it possible the ancient Atlanteans were so advanced they managed to rip a hole in time, i.e. the Bermuda Triangle, and that's why no wreckage is found as it has left our dimension to another time, end quote. In this one sentence, he manages to package together the lost city of Atlantis, ancient advanced technology, rips in the space-time continuum, the Bermuda Triangle, interdimensional travel, and time travel. At the very least, you have to credit the ability of his mind to integrate so much nonsense into one piece of mega-nonsense. It's like when multiple Transformers combine to form one super robot capable of much more impressive feats of violence. Except instead of violence and robots, we're talking about stupidity and ideas here. You'll be truly shocked to find out that these posts of theirs are utterly bereft of supporting evidence. It's almost as if there's a competition going on to see who can out-embarrass each other by proposing the most ludicrous, unsubstantiated explanations. Maybe they got sucked into another dimension, Blobby speculates. Yeah, and maybe they didn't. Is there any good reason to believe that this, or any of the other proposed explanations, are actually operational? I don't see the evidence. All I see is fanciful speculation. If we're just using our imagination to conjure up potential explanations, can't anybody play this game? What if there's a gigantic sea monster that swallows the ship's whole? What if the US government captures the planes and salvages their scrap metal to build secret weapons? As titillating as this is, why just sit around and engage in bizarre speculation, when we could actually research the subject and learn a thing or two? Okay, Mr. Skeptical Human, if it's not Atlantean technology or underwater UFO bases, then what could explain the disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle? Any number of things, actually. It's a mistake to think that there should be one uniform explanation that applies to every single plane and boat disappearance. In some cases, maybe the plane just got lost and they ran out of fuel. Maybe stormy weather conditions caused the ship to sink. Maybe the pilot was drunk, fell asleep at the cockpit, and simply plummeted into the water. Why invoke the fantastic when the ordinary will suffice? While ideally we would want to evaluate the Bermuda Triangle disappearances on a case-by-case basis, there have been proposed some general causes that would apply to many disappearances. For example, weather conditions unique to that area could play a role. As Mindy Weisberger writes on livescience.com, quote, "Tropical storms and hurricanes are common in this region of the Atlantic, which could account for many of the reported disappearances that have happened over the years in the Bermuda Triangle," end quote. The Gulf Stream current in that area could also be responsible for sending ships off course, perhaps into more dangerous waters or weather conditions that they didn't anticipate encountering. Not only that, but this current and the regional topography could also aid in dispersing or hiding much of the debris from plane or boat losses, thus partly explaining what are described as the creepy disappearances within this region. As we read on VolvoOceanRace.com, quote, "Some of the deepest trenches in the world are found in the area of the Bermuda Triangle. Ships or planes that sink into these deep trenches will probably never be found. The Gulf Stream, where the triangle is located, is extremely swift and turbulent. It's been reported to move faster than 5 knots in some areas, more than fast enough to throw sailors hundreds of miles off course if they don't compensate correctly for the current. It can also quickly erase any evidence of a disaster," end quote. Add to this Gulf Stream current the fact that compass readings in this region might fluctuate due to high magnetite concentrations, and you have a recipe for serious navigational confusion, especially for inexperienced sailors. We learn the following in a Science Channel episode of Mysteries of the Missing.
Magnetite is the most magnetic naturally occurring substance on Earth. There is about 500 billion tons around Bermuda. So it's not inconceivable to think that that much magnetite could affect the compasses of ships and possibly even airplanes that are traveling through or near Bermuda.
Another possible explanation for some of the disappearances is the release of natural gas hydrates. As H.J. Gruey writes in Petroleum Engineer International, quote, "Natural gas hydrates occur on the ocean floor in such great volumes that they contain twice as much carbon as all known coal, oil, and conventional natural gas deposits. Releases of this gas caused by sediment slides and other natural causes have resulted in huge slugs of gas-saturated water with density too low to float a ship, and enough localized atmospheric contamination to choke air-aspirated aircraft engines," end quote. So as we can see, there are several plausible non-paranormal explanations for the loss of airplanes and ships within the Bermuda Triangle. Another important point about the triangle is that there's a lot of traffic in this particular region, so it shouldn't come as a surprise if we discovered a large number of plane or boat losses in this area. This could just be the result of basic statistics. Just as if there were more people driving on the roads in a particular city, there would be more opportunities for people to crash into each other, and thus we would see a higher rate of car crashes. As Michael Shermer points out in Why People Believe Weird Things, quote, "Far more shipping lanes run through the Bermuda Triangle than its surrounding areas, so accidents and mishaps and disappearances are more likely to happen in the area. As it turns out, the accident rate is actually lower in the Bermuda Triangle than in surrounding areas," end quote. As further evidence of this latter point, we read on Rational Wiki that, quote, "Insurance rates for shipping and travel within the Bermuda Triangle are no higher than anywhere else," end quote. Here is the single most important point to make about the Bermuda Triangle. There's nothing statistically anomalous about this region. That is to say, there is not a greater risk of your airplane or boat failing or vanishing in this region when compared with the rest of the world. When we watch documentaries or read articles on the subject, we see misleading graphics like this one, from news.com.au, which give the misimpression that there's a uniquely high rate of accidents within the Bermuda Triangle, a problem that other regions simply don't have, and this is just flat out false. Take a look at this map from anychart.com. It shows every airplane crash from 1970 to 2009 with 10 or more fatalities. As we can see, there's a pretty even distribution of airplane crashes all across the world. It's certainly not a problem unique to the Bermuda Triangle, and this region simply doesn't stand out on the map as anomalous. This map from Bloomberg shows all large aircraft disappearances since 1948. Again, the Bermuda Triangle simply doesn't stand out as exceptional. In fact, in other parts of the world, we see a much greater concentration of airplane losses, namely the northwestern tip of South America and Indochina. And even if we looked at the data and did see a cluster around the Bermuda Triangle, and even if all variables like traffic rates and weather conditions were equal across the world, there still wouldn't necessarily be anything unique about this region. This clustering could be purely the result of chance, and drawing a triangle around this cluster could actually be a version of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Imagine a person who takes a pistol, shoots randomly at the side of a barn without looking, and then walks up to the barn and draws a bullseye around the area where there's the greatest concentration of bullets. That is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. As Wikipedia puts it, this fallacy, quote, is related to the clustering illusion, which is the tendency in human cognition to interpret patterns where none actually exist, end quote. There's a very real possibility that people would be doing precisely this with the Bermuda Triangle. To illustrate this principle, I used a map generator from geomidpoint.com to distribute across the world 50 random locations. The second map that I generated showed heavy clustering around the continent of Africa, with no points placed on the continents of North and South America. We might draw a circle around Africa and say, what's the explanation for this high rate of airplane losses? But in this case, there wouldn't be an explanation for this distribution. It would be purely the result of chance. The fourth map that I created showed clustering around Australia. In such a world, would we be speculating about the spooky nature of the Australian Triangle? Even if there was a recognizable, unusual cluster of losses in the Bermuda Triangle, which there isn't, and even if there were no clear factors responsible for this, the explanation could simply be chance distribution. There also seems to be a bit of confirmation bias going on here. Nobody focuses on the thousands of plane flights and the countless boat excursions that have passed directly through the heart of the Bermuda Triangle with absolutely no problem. Instead, we only focus on the very rare trips where something goes wrong. If this place truly was the Devil's Triangle, and there actually was an epidemic of planes and boats vanishing, why would the vast majority make it through utterly unscathed? The thing is, a lot of people don't understand this point, and instead have this misconception that the Bermuda Triangle is this brutally dangerous place, where the moment you cross over the imaginary boundary of the triangle, you enter into this utterly mysterious, rarely traversed territory where death or disappearance is nearly inescapable. For example, YouTube user Administration writes in a comment, quote, "Why don't people fly a drone to see what's there?" End quote. Another guy, the Jerry Republic, floats a similar idea. Quote, "Why not just use a drone and a little remote control ship, then make the drone and the RC ship go over to it, and then sail the little ship into the Bermuda Triangle while the drone watches," end quote. People have this idea that if you enter into the Bermuda Triangle, it's a virtual certainty that you'll never be heard from again, and this is a complete fantasy. There's also the more basic underlying assumption that there is indeed something mysterious about the triangle that needs to be explained, and this is a faulty assumption. Yet this is the framing that countless news organizations put around their content on the subject, with headlines like "Secrets of the Bermuda Triangle" from Fox News, or endless headlines from outlets like Huffington Post or The Telegraph asking if the Bermuda Triangle mystery has finally been solved. The starting position, if we adopt this framing, is that there is a mystery here, and how do we explain it? The real mystery here is that anybody thinks there's a real mystery here. I think the constant media framing of the issue in this way arguably contributes to shaping the faulty views that many people have on this subject. Something else that's pointed to as allegedly mysterious about the triangle is the fact that no trace of many of the boats or planes that get lost here are ever found. Why is anybody surprised by this? The ocean is very big and very deep, so obviously if a boat or plane sinks out here, we're not going to see much evidence of this on the surface. And whatever debris doesn't sink will probably just get pushed around by winds and currents, and thus won't be found in the immediate region where the plane or boat went down. And this isn't a problem unique to the triangle, this is how it would work all across the world. People write articles about the triangle in a campfire storytelling tone where they say things like, "Here's the real spooky part. No trace of the boat was ever found." Yeah, that's probably because it's at the bottom of the fucking ocean right now. I mean, I'm no sailor, but I'm pretty sure that's how boat sinkings work. And I'm sure if you dove down and scoured the ocean floor for long enough, it would eventually turn up. Something that James Randi points out in his book Flim Flam is that there's a lot of deception and dishonesty regarding the Bermuda Triangle. As he writes, quote, "A large percentage of the so-called wonders of the Triangle were nothing but outright fabrications, with no evidence whatsoever to support them. We read about ships that are not listed in any registry, planes for which there are no records to show they ever flew, and shadowy crews and other people who in many instances were well accounted for and did not vanish into the never land that authors like Berlitz would have us believe hold sway in the Caribbean," end quote. He also points out that many of the incidents ascribed to the Triangle in fact have almost nothing to do with it. He shows this map in the book and writes the following, quote, "Look at the accompanying map of the area. On it you will see designated the locations of the major events that the writers would have us accept as proof of the Triangle mystery. How many of these alleged disappearances occurred within the Bermuda Triangle? One that is gleefully offered up by the believers actually happened in the Pacific. Others are not included here because the scale of the map would not allow me to show them. They were as far away as Ireland and the coast of Portugal," end quote. As we can see on the map, the vast majority of incidents that are pointed to as evidence of the Triangle mystery didn't even take place within the Bermuda Triangle. It doesn't get much more illogical than this. Motherfuckers with their lawnmowers. Half the fucking grass is dead out there, and they're like, "Quick, we need to mow this shit. We need to mow this dead grass before it gets out of hand." Ridiculous. They're like, "Oh shit, is that guy recording a YouTube video? Quick, get the loudest machinery we have within a fucking 50-mile radius, and crank that shit to full capacity." They were shopping for lawnmowers, and they were like, "Everything's perfect about this one, but it's not loud enough." So they got some specially designed mufflers to make their lawnmowers as loud as humanly possible. Randi gives an example in the book of how some of these events have only the most tangential connection to the Triangle. Quote, "According to the claimed version of an incident discussed in the Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, quote, 39 persons vanished north of the Triangle on a flight to Jamaica on February 2nd, 1953. And SOS, which ended abruptly without explanation, was sent by the British York transport just before it disappeared. No trace was ever found," end quote. Now let's look at the facts. The flight plan specified Jamaica as a destination, it's true, and this would seem to connect it with the Triangle. But the plane, when it was lost, was on a flight from the Azores to Newfoundland in Canada, a flight that took it along a northwesterly path away from the dreaded area. The plan called for a stop in Newfoundland, then a flight to Jamaica. Since its terminal destination was Jamaica, the promulgators of the legend called it a flight to Jamaica without further explanation. Moreover, the plane admittedly was lost north of the Triangle, 900 miles north of it. There is no mention of the weather, but the New York Times that day reported an icy, gale-swept North Atlantic, strong winds and torrential rains, winds up to 75 miles an hour, end quote. This is just one example of the extreme degree to which Bermuda Triangle believers have to contort themselves in order to scrabble together evidence that supports their position. Now, some would argue that it's not necessarily the sheer number of Bermuda Triangle disappearances that makes this region unique. Instead, it's the circumstances surrounding the disappearances that provides this area with its reputation. So it's worth taking a look at some of the most notorious events that took place in the Triangle to see if they do indeed prove that something strange is going on here. Probably the most famous Bermuda Triangle disappearance is that of Flight 19. During a December 1945 Navy training flight, 5 airplanes and 14 airmen were ultimately lost, as was a rescue plane and its 13 crew members. I find it amazing that this account is so widely cited as proof of the mysterious or sinister nature of the Triangle, because there's a very clear record of documentation outlining precisely what went wrong and what happened to these planes and their pilots. As Evan Andrews writes for History.com, quote, "Flight leader Charles Taylor became convinced that his Avenger's compass was malfunctioning and that his planes had been flying in the wrong direction. The troubles only mounted after a front blew in and brought rain, gusting winds, and heavy cloud cover. Flight 19 became hopelessly disoriented. 'I don't know where we are,' one of the pilots said over the radio. 'We must have got lost after that last turn.' Taylor had become convinced that he might be over the Gulf of Mexico. Hoping to locate the Florida Peninsula, he made a fateful decision to steer Flight 19 northeast, a course that would only take them even farther out to sea. Some of his pilots seemed to have recognized that he was making a mistake. "Damn it," one griped over the radio. "If we would just fly west, we would get home." Flight 19's radio transmission soon became increasingly faint as it meandered out to sea. When fuel began to run low, Taylor was heard prepping his men for a potential crash landing in the ocean. "All planes close up tight," he said. "We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." A few minutes later, the Avenger's last radio communications were replaced by an eerie buzz of static. End quote. Despite the title of this article being The Mysterious Disappearance of Flight 19, there's nothing deeply mysterious about this account, and there's certainly no need to invoke UFOs, interdimensional travel, or the lost city of Atlantis to explain what happened. Basically, the flight leader got lost, led his men in the wrong direction, and they ran out of fuel out at sea. Unless we're audacious enough to describe this as paranormal incompetency, nothing about these events indicates that the Bermuda Triangle is a uniquely spooky or dangerous region. This was just pilot error, plain and simple, and I feel especially bad for Taylor's men, who grudgingly followed him into oblivion despite knowing better. Oh yeah? Well, why was his compass malfunctioning? Maybe his compass was just fucked up. Do electronics and instruments never malfunction? One of the reasons that people think something fishy went on here is that one of the rescue planes that went to search for Flight 19 also went missing. Thus, we're told something truly strange must have been going on. But there's also a pretty clear explanation of what happened to this plane. Aliens abducted it. No, as Andrews continues, quote, "The Navy immediately scrambled search planes to hunt for the missing patrol. Around 7:30 p.m., a pair of PBM Mariner flying boats took off from an air station north of Fort Lauderdale. Just 20 minutes later, however, one of them seemed to follow Flight 19's lead by suddenly vanishing off radar. The remains of the Mariner and its 13 crewmen were never recovered, but it's commonly believed that the seaplane exploded shortly after takeoff. Flying boats were notoriously accident-prone, and were even nicknamed flying gas tanks for their propensity for catching fire. Suspicions that the seaplane may have gone up in flames were all but confirmed by a passing merchant ship, which spotted a fireball and found evidence of an oil slick in the ocean." End quote. Pfft, like I'm gonna trust History.com. I prefer to get my facts from much more reliable sources. The typo-ridden comments posted by anonymous, paranoid users on conspiracy forums. Whenever we're confronted with an event like this, we have an option before us. We can do some research and learn about what actually happened, or we can just make up the most outlandish nonsense. The latter option was wisely chosen by YouTube user Babyface Nelson, who writes the following in a comment, quote, "They flew too far and ended up flying into another Earth area, hidden to our society. But if you keep going straight off Florida, eventually you'll leave Earth as you know it and enter another area of Earth beyond our land, and lands they hide from us. And those planes had to land and then never returned for obvious reasons. They did not die. They lived out their lives in that other area of high technology, basically the future." End quote. Yeah, man, I'm sure that's what happened. And I'm sure you're just overwhelmed by the sheer amount of evidence that you have to support this idea. This guy should change his username from Babyface Nelson to Baby Brain Nelson. Another one of the most widely cited Bermuda Triangle cases involves alleged time travel experienced by the pilot Bruce Gernon. As written on LoveToKnow.com by Sally Painter, quote, "Bruce Gernon, an instrument-rated flight instructor, was flying from Andros Island to Fort Lauderdale. He encountered bad weather and flew into what he described as a tunnel. He claimed to time travel, since he arrived in Fort Lauderdale nearly 30 minutes early, having used 9 gallons less fuel than normal." End quote. Let's look at some more details of his journey into the tunnel, provided on BermudaAttractions.com. Quote, "While flying through the tunnel at 10,000 feet, they saw the cloud around them forming lines and slowly rotating and spiraling in an anti-clockwise direction while propelling them forward. They started having a feeling of zero gravity and all navigational systems started to collapse." End quote. And we read some first-hand details from Bruce Gernon himself on BoaterExam.com. Quote, "Upon entering the cloud, we witnessed an uncanny spectacle. It became dark and black, without rain, and visibility was about 4 or 5 miles. There were no lightning bolts, only extraordinarily bright white flashes that would illuminate the entire surrounding area. The deeper we penetrated, the more intense the flashes became, so we made a 135-degree turn to the left and headed due south out of the cloud. The remarkable thing is that we did not come out of the storm 90 miles away from Miami as we should have. We had traveled through 100 miles of space in 30 minutes of time in a little more than 3 minutes, end quote. The first thing I would ask is, how do we even know that this account is genuine? What evidence is there to support this account other than this guy assuring us that this is what happened? Is it possible that he's exaggerated the details? Could he be genuinely mistaken? Could he have been hallucinating? What if he was on drugs? Could he be flat out lying about this, perhaps for fun or financial gain? This guy seems to be interviewed in every single Bermuda Triangle documentary that's ever been created. Maybe he figured he could tell a wild story like this to get some publicity. The basic point is that just because somebody tells you something happened, doesn't mean that that thing actually happened. As Carl Sagan famously put it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and saying, yeah, this totally happened to me, does not qualify as extraordinary evidence. Where is the hard evidence that this actually took place? Is there some reliable radar data that we can consult to confirm his account of the events, that he was in one place 1 minute and impossibly far away the next? Is there video of him entering into or traveling through this crazy tunnel? Or do all we have to rely on is his word? Are you willing to take him at his word? I'm certainly not. Look at what Gernon writes in the Amazon description of his book Beyond the Bermuda Triangle. Quote, "I didn't believe in time travel or teleportation until it happened to me." End quote. This is no small claim that he's making here. Take a look at some of the credulous reviews on his Amazon page and you quickly lose all hope for humanity. Quote, "I had no idea the time tunnel existed in the so-called Bermuda Triangle and elsewhere in the world." End quote. Yeah, and I think it's safe to say that you still have no idea about this. Quote, "Thus is a great book based on true happens," end quote. Yeah, I guess I'll just have to take your word for it. He claims that he traveled 100 miles in 3 minutes, which works out to about 2,000 miles per hour. This would truly be impressive, and obviously would require some kind of explanation. Couldn't he just be mistaken about this? What if he simply thought that he was farther away from his destination than he actually was? Has a person never become disoriented in this way? You need to look no further than Charles Taylor himself of Flight 19 to see proof that people can become very confused about their location while flying. Or what if Gernon was simply confused about the time? What if he says it was 3 minutes, but he's misremembering the time and it was actually more like 10 minutes? Is it impossible that a person could inaccurately estimate the time, especially in the midst of a stressful encounter like flying through a storm or some spooky clouds? It's also important to distinguish between traveling quickly on one particular leg of the journey and traveling quickly over the entire journey. What if it was his overall trip that took less time and used less fuel than normal, and he's inaccurately concluding that his travel through this cloud was responsible? What if instead the general weather conditions of that day were conducive to higher flying speeds and greater fuel efficiency? Perhaps there was a particularly strong tailwind pushing from the rear of his plane in the direction of his travel. As we read on the website of Conklin and DeDecker, quote, "If the route is 2,100 nautical miles, that is across the ground. Headwinds effectively increase that required distance. If the aircraft cruises at 430 knots in a 70-knot headwind, its ground speed will only be 360 knots. Fly into this headwind for 5 hours, and your trip has effectively increased by 350 miles, almost an hour's flight time," end quote. It seems to logically follow that the reverse of this would be true as well. If you have a 70-knot tailwind, your flight time should be reduced by about an hour. And if you're in the air for less time, you presumably would also use less fuel. They also point out that the fuel efficiency of an aircraft can be impacted by the outside temperature and by the payload aboard the airplane. Now, of course, Gernon's trip from Andros Island to Fort Lauderdale is much shorter than that given in this example, but the same principle could still apply, and this could shave time off his journey. He admittedly did encounter some bad weather, so it's quite possible that there were some strong winds pushing him along. And again, maybe he's also misremembering or exaggerating the time at which he left and the amount of fuel that he had when he set off on his trip. The human memory is not perfect, so this is certainly possible. And speaking of human memory, there are some very important details that we need to take into consideration. His experience in the Bermuda Triangle took place in December of 1970. He also claims that, quote, "In 1972, I heard about the so-called Bermuda Triangle and disappearances of boats and airplanes because of a possible time warp. It was then that I realized that time itself was the key," end quote. And by the key, he means the key to understanding what happened to him that day. So it was about 1 to 2 years after the event that he started to think maybe time travel is what happened that day. Not only that, but his first book was written in 2005, with his second book being written in 2017, 35 and 47 years after the event, respectively. Research indicates that the longer the period of time since a person experiences some incredible event, the more exaggerated and inaccurate will be their recounting of this event. The piece of research that I'm referencing was published in 1996 by Wiseman and Lamont in Nature. What they found is that the longer the period of time since a person witnessed the Indian rope trick, the more impressive was their account of it, as we see illustrated in the scatterplot. As they concluded in the paper, quote, "This analysis strongly suggests that witnesses' testimony had become significantly more elaborate over time," end quote. I don't see why this same principle couldn't apply to an extraordinary event like flying into some scary clouds and arriving at your destination faster than usual. Isn't it possible that in the years and decades since this event took place, Gurnon's memory of the event has become distorted and exaggerated? What is more likely, that this guy is simply mistaken, or that he time-traveled through a wormhole? And what kind of a shitty-ass wormhole is this anyway? When I think of wormholes, I imagine them allowing us to travel across the vast universe, to shrink down an impossible-to-traverse distance into a very short trip. You're telling me that this guy had the unimaginable experience of entering a wormhole, and all that happened was that his plane ride to Fort Lauderdale took less time than normal? Talk about anticlimactic. And when I think of time travel, I imagine going back to the age of the dinosaurs, going thousands of years into the future where I'm surrounded by all kinds of futuristic buildings and flying cars. But this guy's like, yeah, so I time traveled, and my trip took a little less long than it normally does. Whoa, that is fucking mind-blowing. I literally just shit inside of my pants because that is so crazy. From what I know about physics, wormhole formation, while technically possible, would require an enormous amount of energy. Wouldn't there have been all kinds of instruments all around the world that would have detected this vast output of energy? Why is there no such data to support this account? And what's the proposed mechanism of wormhole formation here? Certainly there wouldn't be enough energy within lightning or storms for them to form naturally, so what is responsible? Aliens? Secret government programs? Leftover Atlantean crystals? Aliens involved in a secret government program where they use Atlantean crystals? I would love to see your evidence. Now you might be asking yourself, how do you explain the spooky white flashes within the tunnel? Gurnon asserts that these were not lightning bolts, but he also says that it was a storm that he flew into, so I see no reason to believe that these flashes weren't the result of lightning. What is your explanation for the white flashes? Rips in the space-time continuum? Ridiculous. Oh yeah? Well, why did all of his navigational systems start to malfunction? I don't know, maybe his plane was just shitty. Maybe the electrical energy from the storm somehow interfered with his instruments. Is the only possible explanation for malfunctioning equipment time travel through a wormhole? I don't think so. You might also be asking yourself, well, how do you explain the strange tunnel that he flew into? Let's set aside the potential explanations that involve memory distortion, hallucinations, or intentional fabrication, and let's say that he did indeed fly into a tunnel that matched his description. Couldn't this just have been some weird meteorological phenomena? Our atmosphere generates a huge variety of cloud formations. Isn't it possible that one of them forms something like a tunnel? Indeed, there are on this planet cylindrical clouds that can stretch for miles, and these are known as roll clouds. Isn't it possible that one of these, or something like it, formed within the cloud system that he was flying through? Maybe it was a wormhole that he flew through, or maybe it was just a formation of clouds that looked like a tunnel from the inside. We'll never know for certain, because we weren't there and there's no hard evidence either way, but I think it's much more reasonable to believe that there's a non-paranormal, prosaic explanation for what happened to Bruce Gurnon on his flight through the Bermuda Triangle. I've seen no good reason to believe that there's anything mysterious about this part of the world. There's no convincing evidence to support the outlandish explanations that some people have, and many ordinary events such as bad weather or pilot error can explain the airplane and boat losses within the Bermuda Triangle. Furthermore, the number of disappearances that are recorded in this area are not statistically exceptional, and even if they were, this could purely be the result of chance. Finally, the specific stories cited as proof of the incredible nature of the triangle actually prove nothing of the sort. You can support the production of more content at patreon.com/askepticalhuman. Every little bit truly does help, so please consider doing so. Thank you all for watching and listening, and until next time, take care.